Hello, and welcome to a new story from Deepucator Stories. Have you ever wondered what the most dangerous assumption a person can make is? Is it assuming you know who someone is? Just by looking at them. For Carol Peterson, at Dilient in Forza for her Homeowners Association, assumptions were a tool of her trade. She saw a stranger in a neighbor's garden and saw a problem that needed to be fixed, a rule that needed to be enforced, a man who, in her eyes, did not belong. She demanded his ID. She threatened to call security. What she failed to do was ask a simple question, his name, because if she had, she would have learned that this quiet gardener was the CEO of the corporation that had just become her new employer. Join us for a story that explores what happens when power, prejudice, and a single, catastrophic mistake collide on a perfect suburban street. The demand. How does a Saturday morning change a life? It does not start with a thunderclap, not with a siren in the distance. It begins in the oppressive quiet of a world pretending to be perfect. Willow Creek Estates was such a world, a place where conformity was not just encouraged, it was enforced. The Homeowners Association was not a committee. It was a weather system, a low-pressure front that settled over the manicured lawns and identical mailboxes, promising a storm for any who dared to be different. The HOA was a silent judge in a courtroom with no doors. And its rulebook was the only scripture that mattered. The rules lived in the precise 3-inch height of the grass, in the uniform shade of beige on every front door, in the sanctioned species of flowers one was permitted to plant. From her living room window, Carol Peterson kept her vigil. She was the guardian of this perfection, the keeper of its fragile order. Her clipboard was not just paper and wood. It was an extension of her will. A shield. A scepter. It held the power of bylaws, of fines, of warnings written in cold, black ink. Each checked box was a small victory against the chaos she saw creeping in at the edges of the world. That morning, her attention was a laser, fixed on the house across the street. Number 2, 14. A man was on his knees in the garden. He was black, dressed in old, faded jeans and a plain gray t-shirt that had seen better days. He was tending the roses. His movements were slow, gentle. A weed pulled here. A dead leaf brushed away there. To Carol, he was a flaw in the pattern, a disruption. He did not belong. The image did not fit the pristine grid of Willow Creek. He was an anomaly, a variable she could not account for. The checklist in her mind began to tick with a familiar, satisfying rhythm. An unregistered individual on private property, a potential contractor working on a weekend, a clear violation of Bylaw 47, a threat to the order. She walked across the street, her sensible shoes making soft, determined sounds on the pristine asphalt. The man did not seem to hear her approach. He was whispering to the rose bushes, his large, dirt-stained fingers tracing the delicate edge of a single pink petal. For him, this was not gardening. It was a conversation, a ritual. This was Eleanor's garden. His late wife had planted every single rose bush with her own hands. And here, in the rich scent of the soil and the warmth of the morning sun, he could still feel her presence beside him. "Excuse me." Carol's voice cut through the quiet air. It was sharp. Oficial? The sound of a rule being enforced? Arthur Vance did not look up immediately. He finished pulling a stubborn weed from the base of a particularly vibrant rose bush, the one Eleanor had called Peace. Then, slowly, as if surfacing from a deep dream, he rose to his feet, wiping the dark, rich soil from his hands onto his jeans. "I'm Carol Peterson," she said, tapping a polished fingernail on the clipboard. "I'm on the board of the Homeowners Association." She paused, letting the weight of the title sink in. "I don't have you on our list of approved vendors. I will need to see your identification." "Please." Arthur looked at her. His eyes were calm, but they held a deep, settled weariness. It was the kind of tiredness that comes not from a lack of sleep, but from having the same conversation in different forms for an entire lifetime. "Why would you assume I'm a vendor?" he asked. His voice was quiet. Even. The question seemed to annoy Carol. It was a deviation from her script. It implied she could be wrong. "Sir, this is a private community. We have regulations. For the safety and security of our residents, I need to see proof that you are authorized to be on this property." Authorized. He repeated the word softly, tasting it. He glanced back at the house. At the front window, where a framed photo of Eleanor still sat on the sill, smiling out at the garden she loved. "Yes, I am authorized." Carol's patience, a thin and brittle thing, finally snapped. It was the quiet defiance that bothered her most. It was a language of power she did not understand. "I am asking you for your identification. That is a simple request. If you cannot provide it, I will have to call security to have you escorted off the property." The threat hung in the air. Arthur held her gaze for a long moment. The hum of a distant lawnmower was the only sound. Then, something shifted in his posture. He stood a little straighter. The gardener was gone. His voice was no longer just quiet. It was heavy. It carried the unmistakable weight of boardrooms and conference calls, of skyscrapers and balance sheets. "That won't be necessary." "Carol." He took a small step forward, and she instinctively took one back. "My name is Arthur Vance." The name meant nothing to her. Just a name, spoken with undue confidence. "My company," he continued, his voice calm and deliberate. "Sterling Properties built this house." He gestured with a broad, soil-streaked hand to the other identical homes lining the perfect street. "And your house. And every single house in Willow Creek." He let the silence stretch, letting the impossible words rearrange the very air around them. "We hold the master deed for the entire development." He looked down at the clipboard in her hands. "The source of all her authority. Which means, technically, the homeowners association that you represent and works for me." The clipboard slipped from Carol's suddenly nerveless fingers, papers scattered across the flawless grass like fallen leaves. Bylaws, violations, warnings. They were just words on a page, suddenly stripped of all their power, meaningless in the morning sun. Arthur looked back at the roses. Eleanor's roses. It was for her. After all, it was always for her. The ripple effect. The heavy oak door of Carol Peterson's house clicked shut. But it did not seal her off from the world. It sealed her in with her own spiraling panic. The silence of her immaculate living room was a roaring vacuum, amplifying the frantic beat of her heart against her ribs. She paced from the silk-draped windows to the perfectly polished mantelpiece, her sensible shoes sinking into the plush beige carpet, leaving faint footprints that she would later feel compelled to erase. "I was just doing my job." The thought was a shield, a flimsy piece of cardboard she held up against a tidal wave. The rules? Everyone has to follow the rules. It was the foundation of her entire worldview, the bedrock upon which she had built her identity in Willow Creek. She was not just a resident, she was a steward of order, a defender against the slow decay of standards she saw everywhere else. But the calm, heavy authority in Arthur Vance's eyes had not been chaotic. It had been the sound of a different kind of order, a foundation of granite far deeper and stronger than her own shifting sands of bylaws. Her hands trembled as she forced herself to sit at her antique writing desk. The laptop opened with a soft chime, its screen glowing with an indifferent blue light. She typed the name into the search bar, her fingers fumbling on the smooth, cool keys. Arthur Vance, Sterling Properties. The search engine auto-completed the query before she was finished. A small, digital affirmation of his importance. The results did not just load, they cascaded down the screen. An avalanche of success. There were photographs of him in tailored suits, his smile confident and easy as he stood beside governors and senators, Articles in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal detailing billion-dollar acquisitions, philanthropic endeavors, and his visionary approach to sustainable urban development. He wasn't just a developer, he was an institution. A pillar of the very economy that allowed for the existence of pristine communities like Willow Creek. The man she had threatened to have escorted off the property like a common trespasser owned the very ground she stood on. A cold dread, slick and oily, seeped into her bones, chilling her from the inside out. The rulebook, her sacred text, offered no protection now. The rules, she realized with sickening clarity, were his. Across the street, in the quiet sanctuary of his home office, Arthur Vance stared out at the garden. The room was lined with books on history, architecture, and philosophy, the scent of old paper and leather a familiar comfort. He watched a monarch butterfly dance around the peace rosebush, its vibrant orange wings a stark contrast to the deep green leaves. There was no victory in him, no surge of righteous satisfaction, only a profound, bone-deep weariness that settled in his shoulders like a physical weight. This encounter was not unique. It was a single, discordant note in a long, repeating symphony of assumptions he had faced his entire life. He remembered the real estate agent who had shown him less desirable properties until he mentioned his company's name. He remembered the maitre d' who had tried to steer him away from a prime table. He remembered the countless small moments, the subtle shifts in tone, the glances of surprise when people realized who he was. The suit he wore, the car he drove, the neighborhood he lived in, they were just temporary passes, easily revoked by the judgment in a stranger's eyes. This morning, dressed in old clothes and kneeling in the dirt, he had revoked his own pass, just to see what would happen. And the result was depressingly predictable. He sighed, a sound that held decades of practiced patience. He turned his gaze from the window and focused on the cool, impersonal glow of his computer screen, seeking the familiar distraction of work, an escape into a world of numbers and contracts, a world where his authority was defined by results, not appearances. An email sat at the top of his inbox, flagged for his immediate attention. Subject: finalization of Midwest Asset Management acquisition. He opened it, his mind shifting gears, scanning the logistical details, the transition plans for the newly acquired company, to keep his mind occupied, to push away the lingering frustration from the morning. He scrolled down to the attached document, a list of key personnel who would be integrated into the Sterling Properties family. Senior account managers, operations coordinators, regional supervisors. He scanned the names without much interest. A roster of strangers who were now his responsibility, until one leaped off the page. It was a simple, common name. But in that moment, in that context, it felt like a thunderclap in the quiet room. Carol Peterson, senior account manager. He had to read it twice. Then a third time, his finger tracing the letters on the screen as if to confirm they were real. He leaned back in his rich leather chair, the smooth material creaking under his weight in the profound silence. He stared at the name on the screen. Glowing in the sterile light of the monitor, the woman from the HOA, the keeper of the rules, the enforcer of beige. She was not just his confrontational neighbor. She was now, officially, his employee. The problem had just become infinitely more complex. The tidy lines between his worlds had been erased. It was no longer a personal matter between two people on a quiet suburban street. It was now a corporate issue, a leadership issue, a cultural issue. His issue, in that moment, Arthur Vance's two worlds, the private sanctuary he had built with Eleanor and the professional empire he commanded, collided with the force of a tectonic shift. And a true leader is not defined by how they celebrate their victories, but by how they handle the unexpected collisions. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he had to make a call. The call. Arthur Vance looked at the corporate directory on his screen. The name David Chen illuminated by the cursor. His first instinct was to call human resources to initiate a formal, by-the-book process. It would be clean, documented, and would absolve him of direct involvement. It would also be a colossal failure of leadership. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with a form or a standardized procedure. This was about culture. And culture, he knew, wasn't shaped in the HR department. It was forged in the interactions between managers and their teams. This was not about punishing a single employee. It was about diagnosing a symptom of a potentially larger disease within the company he had just acquired. You don't fire the patient to cure the illness. You investigate the cause. His finger hovered over the name David Chen, the direct manager, the first line of defense, the person whose own biases and training or lack thereof had allowed an employee like Carol to feel so empowered in her assumptions. The problem had to be addressed at its root. He pressed the call button. Across town, David Chen was trying to assemble a new piece of Scandinavian furniture. The cryptic instructions spread across his living room floor. At 35, he was one of the youngest vice presidents at Midwest Asset Management, a rising star known for his sharp analytical skills and unwavering ambition. The acquisition by Sterling Properties was the biggest thing that had ever happened to his career. A golden ticket. When his phone rang and the name Arthur Vance's flashed on the screen, his heart leaped into his throat. This was it. A chance to impress the new big boss. To show him he was dedicated, even on a weekend. Good morning, Mr. Vance. An honor to hear from you. See ya, David said, his voice a little too bright, a little too eager, as he scrambled to his feet. Arthur's voice, in contrast, was a calm, steady baritone. There was no small talk, no preamble. David, I'm calling you this morning about one of your team members, an employee by the name of Carol Peterson. The name landed like a block of ice in David's stomach. Carol. He mentally scanned his files on her. She was one of his most reliable, if rigid, employees. Meticulous, punctual, a stickler for rules and procedures. She was the last person he would expect to cause a problem that would warrant a call from the CEO. Yes. See ya. Carol, a valued member of our team. Is there an issue? There was an incident this morning at my home. Arthur began. He recounted the events in the garden with the factual, dispassionate precision of a CEO reviewing a quarterly report. He used neutral, observational language. He did not say she threatened me or she was prejudiced. He simply stated the facts. She made an assumption about me based on my appearance. She then proceeded to demand identification and threatened to involve security. That sequence of actions is not in line with the values we uphold at Sterling Properties. David felt the blood drain from his face. The cryptic furniture instructions suddenly seemed profoundly simple compared to this. He stammered, a flood of panicked apologies tumbling from his lips. Mr. Vance, I am so deeply sorry. I don't know what to say. This is completely unacceptable. I will handle this immediately. I assure you, it will not happen again. He was already mentally drafting a termination letter. It was the cleanest, quickest way to solve the problem, a decisive action to show the new boss he was in control. Stop, Arthur said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through David's panic like a surgeon's scalpel. I don't want you to handle her. This is not about punishment. There was a pause that felt to David like an eternity. I want you to talk to her. I want you to ask her to write a detailed report of the incident. From her perspective, I want her to explain the reasoning behind her actions. David was utterly confused. A report. It felt like an absurdly bureaucratic response to such a personal offense. Sir, with all due respect, I can assure you her employment will be terminated. That is not what I am asking for. Arthur interrupted, his voice gaining a hard edge of command. I need to understand her thought process. I need to understand what in her training, or in the culture you've overseen at Midwest, made her believe her actions were appropriate. This is not a moment for discipline, David, it is a moment for diagnosis. Do you understand? The question was not a suggestion. It was an order. Yes. See ya, David said. His own ambition, now warring with his confusion. He didn't fully understand the strategy. But he understood the directive. He just knew he had a task. A strange and deeply uncomfortable one. Good. Keep me informed. The line went dead. David Chen stood motionless in his living room, staring at his phone, his hand trembling slightly. The call was over, but another call, one that would be infinitely more difficult and consequential, was about to be made. And for Carol Peterson, that ringing phone would be the sound of her meticulously ordered world beginning to fracture. That phone call is the beginning of the longest weekend of Carol's life. She's not being asked for an apology. She's being asked for the truth behind her own thoughts. Will she protect herself with excuses? Or will she choose the brutal path of honesty? If you think she will tell the whole truth, no matter the cost, comment the word honesty below. The blank page is waiting. So don't go anywhere. Deepu Cater Stories, where the real story is what happens next. The Reckoning. The phone rang with the shrill urgency of an alarm bell. Carol Peterson saw the name on the screen. David Chen, her boss. On a Saturday, a wave of nausea washed over her. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, why he was calling. She took a deep breath, her hand shaking as she answered. David. His voice was not angry. It was worse. It was cold. A flat, professional tone that offered no comfort, no sympathy. It was the voice of a man distancing himself from a problem. He told her about his call with Mr. Vance. He did not embellish. He did not soften the blow. He simply relayed the facts. And then, the instruction. He wants a report. Carol, on your desk? Monday morning, detailing the entire incident. And he wants you to explain your reasoning. The word hung in the air between them. Reasoning. What reasoning could she possibly offer? That she was just following the rules. She knew, instinctively, that answer would not be enough. After the call ended, she sat in front of her laptop, the screen a blank. White void. She stared at the blinking cursor for hours. It mocked her. A tiny, rhythmic pulse of judgment. She tried to write, I was performing my duties as a member of the HOA board. She deleted it. It sounded hollow. My actions were motivated by a concern for community security. She deleted that too. It felt like a lie. Every excuse she constructed crumbled under the weight of the memory of his calm eyes, the memory of the dirt on his hands, the memory of the quiet way he had dismantled her entire world with just a few sentences. There was no anger in him, and that was the most damning part. There was only disappointment. Frustrated, she pushed away from the desk. She walked to the window and looked out at house number 214. The garden was empty now. The sun cast long shadows across the lawn. She felt a desperate need to justify herself, to find a piece of evidence that proved she was not the person she feared she was. And then, a memory surfaced, unbidden, unwelcome. It was from Tuesday afternoon. Mr. Henderson from down the street, a retired white man, had been using a loud leaf blower outside the permitted hours. The noise had been irritating. What had she done? She had simply closed her window and thought, he's just tidying up his yard. She had not marched across the street. She had not demanded his ID. She had not threatened to call security. She had seen one of her own, and she had given him the benefit of the doubt. The contrast struck her with the force of a physical blow. She had not treated Arthur Vance the same way. She had seen a black man in old clothes, and her mind had not offered the benefit of the doubt. It had jumped straight to suspicion. 2 rules. 2 threats. The realization was a bitter pill. Tears welled in her eyes. Hot and shameful, they were not tears of self-pity. They were tears of recognition. She saw the ugly truth of her assumption, bare and undeniable. She sat back down at her computer. This time, she did not try to write an excuse. She wrote a confession. She wrote about the automatic surprise she felt, seeing a black man in a well-tended garden in her neighborhood. She wrote about the internal script that immediately labeled him contractor or outsider. She wrote about the fact that she had never once thought to simply ask his name. She had gone straight to demanding proof that he belonged. The words flowed out of her, raw and unfiltered. It was the most honest thing she had ever written. When she was done, she stared at the document on the screen. It was not a report to save her job. It was an inventory of her own failure. With a final, trembling breath, she attached the file to an email and pressed send, a digital message flying through the void. It was not just a work document. It was a confession. And now, it was in the hands of the man she had judged, awaiting a judgment of his own. The system and the memory. Arthur Vance read Carol's report not in his office, but in the quiet solitude of his study late on Sunday evening. The email had been forwarded to him by a very nervous David Chen, with a subject line that simply read, "As requested." He opened the document on his tablet, the screen casting a soft glow in the dim room. He had expected a carefully worded defense, a piece of corporate doublespeak designed to minimize liability. He had expected excuses. He did not get them. What he read was raw, unflinching, and painfully honest. It was a confession, not a report. Carol had dissected her own thought process with a brutal clarity that surprised him. She wrote about the silent, unconscious sorting mechanism in her mind that had labeled him other. She wrote about the false sense of authority her clipboard and her HOA title had given her. She wrote about the stark, shameful memory of how she had treated Mr. Henderson differently, just days before. He wasn't reading the words of a corporate drone trying to save her job. He was reading the words of a human being grappling, perhaps for the first time, with a profound personal failing. He did not feel anger, nor did he feel triumph. He felt a sliver of hope, thin but resilient, that people could indeed see their own reflection and choose to change. But the hope was tempered by a larger question. His gaze drifted from the tablet to the window, looking out into the dark, quiet street. This wasn't just about Carol. A person does not form these biases in a vacuum. He thought about her 20-plus years at Midwest Asset Management. What kind of corporate culture had she been marinating in? What kind of training, if any, had she received on diversity, equity, and inclusion? He suspected he knew the answer, and more importantly, what were they? Sterling Properties. Going to do to ensure this wouldn't happen again with the next employee. And the next. He sent a short email to his executive assistant. Please send me the complete new hire orientation package from Midwest, as well as our own current module on diversity and inclusion. An hour later, the files were in his inbox. He opened them, and his sliver of hope began to shrink. The training materials were exactly as he'd feared, a collection of sterile PowerPoint slides filled with corporate jargon, stock photos of smiling, diverse teams, and multiple-choice quizzes that a clever child could pass. It was training designed not to change minds, but to check a legal box. It was a shield against lawsuits, not a tool for building empathy. It was a system designed to fail. His eyes fell upon a photograph on the corner of his desk. It was of his late wife, Eleanor. She was smiling, her eyes crinkling at the corners, a summer hat perched on her head. The photo was taken in their garden. Right beside the peace rose bush, Eleanor had been a civil rights attorney, a quiet warrior who fought her battles not in loud protests, but in dusty law libraries and quiet, persistent advocacy. He remembered one of their last long conversations. Sitting on a bench in that very garden, she had taken his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Arthur," she'd said, her voice soft but clear as a bell, "you build magnificent houses, structures of steel and glass, But what matters more are the communities that live inside them. Never forget that. Make sure you are building bridges, not walls. The memory washed over him, not as a sad echo of the past, but as a living directive, a mission. He looked back at the useless training slides on his screen, then back at Eleanor's smiling face. This was his chance to honor her legacy in a way he hadn't fully understood until now. He would not just update a few slides or add a new quiz. He would tear the whole thing down and start over. He would build something real, something that created conversations, not just compliance. He envisioned a new program, not a training module, but an initiative, a series of facilitated dialogues, real-world scenario workshops, and sessions focused on genuine self-reflection. He would call it the Bridge Initiative. It would be Eleanor's legacy, written into the very DNA of his company. He picked up his phone. He did not call David Chen. He did not call a committee. He called Maria Flores, his head of human resources, a woman he trusted to understand the difference between process and purpose. "Maria," he said when she answered, his voice infused with a passion and clarity that had been absent just hours before. "Cancel all current cultural sensitivity training sessions. Effective immediately." Sir Maria's voice was filled with confusion. "But the quarterly compliance reports, we are no longer in the business of compliance." Arthur interrupted, his voice steady and absolute. "We are in the business of connection. We are going to start over. From scratch." A wrongful demand in a garden had become the seed of a corporate-wide transformation, but a system is made of people, and to change the system, you must first reach the people, and the journey for Carol and Arthur was only just beginning. The first step. The invitation arrived in Carol Peterson's inbox on a Thursday morning. It was from Human Resources. The subject line was Neutral Mandatory Leadership Dialogue Session. But for Carol, it felt like a summons. Her name was on a list with 15 other senior managers from the newly merged company. The session was the first of something called the Bridge Initiative. Her stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. This was it. The public shaming, the corporate execution. She spent the next 2 days in a state of quiet dread. She walked into the conference room on Monday morning feeling as if every eye in the building was on her. The room was bright, with floor-to-ceiling windows, but it felt like a courtroom to her. She chose a seat in the corner, hoping to become invisible, to merge with the beige walls. She clutched a notepad and pen, her hands clammy. A woman with a calm, intelligent face and warm, dark eyes stood at the front of the room. This was Dr. Anya Sharma, a renowned organizational culture consultant. She was not what Carol had expected. There was no PowerPoint presentation queued up on the large screen. There were no binders or handouts on the polished table. "Good morning." Dr. Sharma began, her voice gentle but commanding. "Welcome. Today, we have no slides. We have no charts. We only have our stories, and our willingness to listen to the stories of others." Carol's dread deepened. This was going to be worse than a lecture. Then, the conference room door opened, and Arthur Vance walked in. He was not wearing a suit, but a simple, well-tailored blazer and dark slacks. He was holding a cup of coffee. He did not take a seat at the head of the table. Instead, he took the empty chair right in the middle of the group. Becoming one of them, a wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Dr. Sharma smiled faintly. "Thank you for joining us. Arthur, as you all can see, this initiative begins at the very top. Arthur has offered to be our first storyteller." Arthur looked around the table, his gaze calm and direct. When his eyes met Carol's, there was no anger, no judgment, just a quiet acknowledgement. Carol felt her face flush, and she quickly looked down at her blank notepad. "I'm not here today as your CEO," Arthur began, his voice filling the suddenly silent room. "I'm here as a person. I want to tell you about the first time I tried to buy a car. He told a story from when he was 20 years old, a story of saving up every dollar from 2 summer jobs to buy a slightly used sensible sedan. He described walking into the dealership, full of pride and excitement, only to be completely ignored by the salesman, who walked past him to help a white couple who had entered after him. He didn't tell the story with bitterness. He told it with a profound, lingering sadness, the sadness of a young man whose hard work and achievement had been rendered invisible by the color of his skin, the sadness of being judged before he even had a chance to speak. The story settled over the room, thick and heavy. Dr. Sharma then guided them through an exercise. "I'd like each of you to think of a time," she said softly, "when you felt you were seen, but not truly seen. A time when someone made an assumption about you that erased who you really were, one by one." People shared. A woman spoke of constantly being mistaken for an administrative assistant in meetings. A younger man spoke of being dismissed as inexperienced because of his age. When it was Carol's turn, her heart pounded. All she could manage to say, in a small, tight voice, was something about being overlooked in a meeting once, dominated by male colleagues. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew how hollow they sounded. She could feel the vast, cavernous difference between her experience and the one Arthur had described. The session ended with one final question from Dr. Sharma. "After hearing these stories today, is there an action you feel you need to take? An action that would build a bridge instead of a wall?" In that moment, Carol looked up. Her eyes met Arthur's across the table, and in his gaze, she saw not an accuser, but a man who had shown his own vulnerability to a room full of strangers. He had built a bridge, and she knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that she had to try and walk across it. She spent the rest of the day in a daze. The session had not been a punishment. It had been an invitation to see the world differently. Back at her desk, she stared at her computer screen for a long time. Then, with trembling fingers, she composed a short, simple email to Arthur Vance's executive assistant. It read, "Would it be possible for Mr. Vance to spare me 5 minutes of his time? I would like to offer him a personal apology." She hit send. There was no confidence, no sense of HOA authority, none of the certainty she'd felt that Saturday morning. There was only the terrifying vulnerability of asking for grace. And now, all she could do was wait. The conversation. The reply came less than an hour later. It was brief and direct. "Mr. Vance can see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. Please meet him at the rooftop conservatory." The rooftop conservatory, not his imposing corner office, not a sterile conference room. Carol felt a flicker of surprise. The choice of location felt intentional, human. She spent a sleepless night replaying what she would say, her carefully constructed sentences falling apart and reforming in the dark. The next morning, she rode the executive elevator to the top floor, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The conservatory was a stunning glass dome filled with light and lush greenery. Orchids of every color hung in the humid air, and the gentle sound of a small waterfall trickled in the background. It was a world away from the beige conformity of Willow Creek. Arthur Vance was standing by a collection of rare orchids, a small silver watering can in his hand. He was dressed simply, in slacks and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He looked more like a botanist than a CEO. He turned as she approached, a calm, unreadable expression on his face. "Carol, thank you for coming," he said, his voice quiet. All her rehearsed speeches evaporated. She was left with nothing but the raw, unvarnished truth. "Mr. Vance," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here to say that I was wrong, completely and utterly wrong." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "The assumption I made about you was wrong, and it came from a place inside of me, a prejudice, that I didn't even know was there. I am so deeply sorry for the hurt I caused you. The apology hung in the warm, humid air between them. It was simple. It was absolute. Arthur placed the watering can down on a stone ledge. He studied her face for a long moment, as if searching for something. Then he nodded slowly. I accept your apology. Carol. A wave of relief so intense it almost made her dizzy washed over her. But he wasn't finished. But I need you to understand something. He continued, his tone shifting from formal to something more personal, more direct. For you, what happened was a single, terrible incident, an embarrassing mistake. For me, it was a Saturday. He gestured for her to walk with him along the stone path. The burden isn't in any one encounter. It's in the accumulation. It's the constant, low-level hum of having to prove you belong. It's the salesman, the maitre d's, the neighbors. Each one is just a small drop of water. But over a lifetime, those drops can wear away stone. He stopped and looked at her, his gaze penetrating. The deepest hurt wasn't that you thought I was a contractor. It was the immediate assumption that I couldn't possibly be your neighbor. Carol felt the full weight of his words, of his experience. For the first time, she wasn't just feeling ashamed of her actions. She was beginning to understand the depth of their impact. She thought she would be fired now. It seemed like the only logical conclusion. But Arthur's next words surprised her completely. I don't believe in throwing people away. Carol, I believe in growth. He looked at her. A glimmer of something that wasn't pity, but perhaps a challenge. In his eyes, your report, and the fact that you are standing here today, tells me that you are capable of it. The question is, what will you do with it? You can go back to your desk and continue being a good senior account manager. But I hope you'll choose to be more than that. I hope you'll choose to be one of the people who helps us build the bridges. He was not firing her. He was offering her a purpose, a chance for redemption that was not about punishment, but about participation. He was offering her a second chance. Arthur offered a second chance, not a termination letter. He believes people can grow from their biggest mistakes, but it's a difficult path. If you believe Carol deserves this second chance, comment the word growth below. A single opportunity is just a starting point. Now we'll see if she can truly transform herself and an entire corporate culture. Don't miss what happens next. The new culture. 6 months passed. Autumn painted the oak trees of Willow Creek in hues of gold and crimson. The air grew crisp. Inside the gleaming towers of Sterling Properties, something was changing too. The bridge initiative was no longer just an idea. It had become a cornerstone of the company's culture. A living, breathing part of its identity. The change wasn't loud or sudden. It was a gradual shift. A slow turning. Like a great ship changing its course in the open sea, it was felt in the way people spoke to each other in meetings. In the questions managers were trained to ask, and in the stories that were now encouraged, not silenced. The change was most visible in the new employee orientation. In a bright, sunlit conference room, a group of 20-some fresh-faced new hires listened intently. At the front of the room stood David Chen. He was more relaxed now, his ambition tempered with a newfound sense of purpose. At Sterling Properties, he said, his voice resonating with a sincerity it hadn't possessed 6 months ago. We build communities, but we know that the strongest foundations are not made of concrete. They're made of respect. He gestured to the woman standing beside him. And to talk more about what that means in practice, I'd like to introduce one of the most passionate champions of our culture, a senior account manager and a vital member of our Bridge Initiative mentorship team, Carol Peterson. Carol stepped forward. The woman who now stood before the new hires was not the same person who had clutched a clipboard in a quiet garden. The rigidity in her posture was gone. Replaced by a calm and open confidence, she smiled. A genuine, warm expression that reached her eyes. She no longer needed a rulebook for her authority. She found it within herself. Good morning, everyone. She began. I'm not here to talk to you about bylaws or procedures. I'm here to tell you a short story about a mistake I made. She shared an edited, anonymized version of her encounter with Arthur. She didn't reveal his name or title, only referring to him as a respected leader in our company. She spoke not with shame, but with the quiet authority of lived experience. She talked about the danger of assumptions, the blindness of privilege, and the profound importance of a simple, human question, what is your name, before a demand for identification. She ended by saying, our job here isn't just to manage properties, it's to see the people who live and work in them. See them first. Always. The new hires were silent, captivated not by a corporate slogan, but by a moment of real human vulnerability. Carol had found her redemption, not in forgetting her mistake, but in using it as a tool to build a better bridge for others, miles away. On that same afternoon, Arthur Vance made an unannounced visit to a new construction site on the outskirts of the city. It was a sprawling development of affordable housing, a project he was personally passionate about. He pulled his familiar black truck up to the chain-link fence that served as the main gate. He was dressed, as he often was on site visits, in work boots, jeans, and a simple navy polo shirt with a small, discreet Sterling Properties logo. Before he could even put the truck in park, a young man in a bright yellow safety vest and a hard hat stepped out of the security booth. He was young, maybe 22, with a serious expression. He held up a hand, a clear but polite signal to stop. Arthur rolled down his window. Good afternoon, sire, the young man said, his voice respectful but firm. Welcome to the Sterling construction site. For safety and insurance purposes, all unscheduled vehicles need to be logged before proceeding. Could I get your name and the purpose of your visit? Please. The procedure was entirely different. There was no accusation in his tone. No suspicion. Just a calm, professional process applied equally to everyone. Arthur smiled faintly. Arthur Vance. I'm here for a site inspection. The young security guard, whose name tag read Marcus, did not flinch. He consulted a tablet he was holding. Yes. Mr. Vance, we have you on the approved executive visitor list. Mi apologies. I didn't recognize you. Sire. You're not supposed to, Arthur said warmly. You're supposed to follow protocol. You're doing your job perfectly. What's your name, Marcus? Sire. Well done. Marcus. Marcus beamed with pride and waved him through. As Arthur drove onto the dusty site, his sense of satisfaction was deep and quiet. This was the change. This was what it looked like. It wasn't about people recognizing him. It was about them having a system of respect that worked even when they didn't. Later, as he walked through the skeletal frame of what would soon be a community center, he saw a small, laminated poster tacked to the temporary wall of the site office. It was a simple quote, attributed to E. Vance's. It read, "We build bridges, not walls." Arthur stopped and looked at the poster, his wife's words in a place she had never been, influencing people she would never meet. A soft, genuine smile touched his lips. The bridges were being built, not just of steel and concrete, but of understanding and respect. The change was real, and sometimes, to truly appreciate how far you've come, you need to return to where it all began. The garden. A year had passed. The cycle of the seasons had turned once more, and it was a perfect Saturday morning in Willow Creek. The sun was warm, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak trees. Arthur Vance was on his knees in his garden. The peace rosebush was in full, glorious bloom, its pale yellow petals edged with a delicate pink blush. He wasn't whispering to the roses today. He was simply enjoying them, his hands moving with the easy, familiar rhythm of a contented man. The garden was no longer a place of solemn remembrance. a sanctuary to escape to. It had become a place of simple, present joy. The weariness that had settled in his bones that morning a year ago was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. He heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the sidewalk behind him and the murmur of conversation. He glanced over his shoulder. It was Carol and her husband, out for their morning walk. A year ago, this moment would have been thick with unspoken tension, an awkward silence hanging between the two houses. But now, Carol's husband raised a hand in a friendly wave. Carol herself smiled, a relaxed, easy expression that transformed her face. "Good morning, Arthur," she called out, her voice light and clear. "Your roses are absolutely beautiful this year." There was no formality. No Mr. Vance's, just a neighbor admiring another's garden. "Thank you, Carol," Arthur called back, his own smile coming just as naturally. "Enjoy your walk." They moved on down the street, their conversation resuming its gentle rhythm. The exchange had been brief, simple, and utterly normal, and in its normality, it was profound. It was the sound of a bridge that had been successfully built and crossed so many times it was now just an ordinary part of the landscape. There was no ghost of the past haunting the space between them. Arthur turned his attention back to the perfect rose in front of him. He gently touched one of its soft petals. He thought of Eleanor. He knew she would be proud, not because he had won a confrontation, not because he was a powerful CEO who had forced a change in policy, but because he had chosen to see the humanity in someone who had failed to see his. He had chosen to diagnose, not to punish. He had chosen to build a bridge right here, in the very garden she had planted. He understood now that true strength wasn't about never being wronged. It was about what you chose to do with that wrong. You could let it harden you, build a wall around your heart, or you could use it as a blueprint, a reason to build a better.com, stronger bridge, so the next person wouldn't have to face the same chasm. The world did not change overnight. It rarely does, but sometimes, all it takes is one difficult conversation, one second chance, one person's willingness to see the human being behind their own assumptions. Because in the end, respect should not be the reward we give to people once we recognize their importance. It must be the foundation upon which all recognition is built. And so, our story comes to a close, leaving us with a quiet but powerful truth. The most important bridges we can ever build are not of steel, but of empathy. It reminds us that respect should never wait for a title or a name tag. It should be the very first thing we offer to one another. What are your thoughts on second chances and the power of quiet leadership? We would be honored to read about them in the comments below. If stories that explore the complexities of the human heart are what you seek, we hope you'll consider subscribing to Deepu Kader Stories. Thank you, truly, for being here with us today.